You don't know Jack.
Oasis. If you're British, it's almost guaranteed that you've come across them in some form during your life. Whether that's through some of the most popular songs such as Wonderwall, Don't Look Back in Anger or Stop Crying Your Heart Out, through their infamous rivalry with Blur, or through learning about the main men themselves, Noel and Liam Gallagher, who perform alongside several other members. Whatever the case, you've most likely heard of Oasis, and you may have heard of how Noel and Liam don't always get on. They've had their spats in the media, in private, via legal threats, pretty much every way imaginable, and one of my favourite media types they've argued over is that of the 7-inch vinyl, Wibbling Rivalry, a single released by the record label Fierce Panda in 1995 under the name Oasis with an asterisk in replacement of the I. The single contains, as described on the cover, 14 minutes of verbal mayhem, which all stemmed from a very public incident a few months prior, where the whole band, except for Noel, were arrested on a boat for inciting and taking part in a drunken brawl. The back of the cover gives some more details. Springtime, Scottish style, too much G&T, road fever, midnight in a disinfected hotel. The two brothers at the core of the most hell-ride rock and roll band in the world, a few associates and a journalist's tape recorder. The rest pass in a haze of shouting, swearing, smoking, and anxious televisions teetering on the brink of being hurled from windows. Supersonic, simple as. So, how did this swearfest of a single come to be? Let's find out, shall we? The 90s were a great time to be a Britpop fan. Legendary acts like Blur, Pulp, Suede, and of course Oasis were beginning to emerge and became chart-topping acts very quickly. However, things were quiet at the start of the decade. The first whimpers at the beginning of Britpop came from albums like 1993's Modern Life is Rubbish by Blur and the self-titled Suede album, both of which were formative in the sound of Britpop, especially the latter, which received great critical praise. Meanwhile, around this time, Oasis had only recently formed, with most of their time being dedicated to live shows and demo creation. But their biggest break came in May of 1993, when they were offered a contract under Creation Records. A few months later, the contract was officially signed. It seemed as though Oasis were on the verge of a breakthrough. So, on February 17th, 1994, they ended up on a European tour, which involved them cruising on a ferry to Amsterdam. However, things didn't go to plan, because after some people started getting themselves intoxicated, fighting began to break out and Liam seemed to be inciting it. By the end of it, everyone in the band except Noel had been arrested and they were all deported back to the UK. There's a really good video by James Hargreaves who goes into a lot of depth talking about the Ferry incident in full. I'll put it in the top right corner for you to check out after this. A couple months later, on April 7th, 1994, the pair sat down with NME journalist John Harris to have an interview. There was a tape recorder present at the interview. Harris pressed the record button at the start and what followed was, more or less, the contents of Wibbling Rivalry. Now, as much as I'd love to, I'm not going to play the full interview in this video, as there's already videos online of the full thing, and I'll link them in the top right if you're interested. But I like to try and summarise the chaos. The single is split up into the Noel side and the Liam side. Noel side features, quote, a lot of swearing and cussing, whereas Liam's features, quote, even more swearing and cussing. With that being said, let's get started on Noel's side. As I mentioned, this was an interview for NME, so it starts off fairly normally, with Harris asking Noel and Liam about being seen as rock and roll animals.
I'm into it, mate. I'm into it, but at the end of the day, then, I'm not, because like he says, cheeky cunt. I go home and get a clip off me mum. You know what I mean? And I do. She clip me now and then, and go, what are you fucking like, you live in the same shit.
Yeah, clip after Amsterdam.
Oh yeah, get it all the time, you know what I mean? Looks at me and go, you fucking bastard.
But it derails quickly when Noel says,
The thing about getting thrown off ferries, blah blah blah, getting deported is something that I'm not proud about. Because
which Liam replies to with,
Well, I am now.
yeah, alright, well if you're
causing Noel to spark everything off with,
well if you're if you're proud about getting thrown off ferries, then why don't you go and support West Ham? Get the fuck out of my band and go be a football hooligan, right?
From this point onwards, there's no saving the conversation despite Harris's attempts to steer it back on track. The pair starts to argue about the ferry incident, with Noel saying that Oasis' manager Marcus Russell said that Liam thinks it's rock and roll to get thrown off ferries, which Liam denies. Noel keeps telling Liam to shut up and also says that it's football hooliganism, and Liam responds with a simple, no it isn't. As Noel goes to the toilet, Harris asks Liam about if he wants to be seen as a bad lad, to which he says no. Noel overhears this and shouts that he's not a bad lad. Turning the tables on who tells who to shut up, Liam starts to control the conversation by explaining that he wants to be seen as himself, which is why he had a few drinks and did what he did, all the while Noel makes noises such as ER. Liam mentions a quote from Bobby Gillespie, who said he was sick of bands who didn't get in situations, bringing up the Sex Pistols as an example of bands who did, to which Noel responds by saying the word bullshit 6 times. They start to argue about what rock and roll is. Liam has the belief that it's about being yourself, whereas Noel thinks it's about the music. Liam claims that the Sex Pistols were one of the best rock and roll bands ever, which Noel denies because they only made 1 album. Harris mentions that the Rolling Stones often got arrested, which Liam responds to by saying that's what made them so good, to Noel's disbelief. Liam clarifies his point by saying that they had something else alongside it, which is a life. Noel fights back by reintroducing Liam's quote that he apparently said, but I can't find the source, that he thinks it's rock and roll to get thrown off ferries, which I think Noel got confused with Marcus Russell, the band's manager, but I guess that's what too much G&T will do to you. Liam recalls that everyone was getting hung up over it, which made him laugh about the whole situation, to which Noel says that they're not a bunch of boxers. Harris interjects by saying that Oasis is being written about in terms of their music about 70% of the time, and the other 30% are about Oasis being Oasis, which both Gallagher seem to agree and be fine with. Liam recalls an anecdote of when he was getting ready to shoot a music video in which he had makeup on, before an encounter with a woman named Pauline with a Jamaican accent. I've watched this several times and I have no clue as to the point Liam was making, but his bottom line is that it was just a situation that arose. This gets them back to arguing about the difference between life in Oasis and personal life, with Noel saying to Liam, why don't you go downstairs and smash the bar up and say you're the singer of Oasis? Liam retorts saying he doesn't want to, but if he did want to, he would. Noel says that Liam doesn't speak for the band, and that's where this side of the single concludes. Let's move on to the Liam side. We start right where we left off on the Noel side, with the argument over who speaks for the band, if anyone, leaving Liam to say that Noel is a priest, but Noel clarifies that the difference between them is that he doesn't get caught. Noel also says to Liam that there's a difference between being on a ferry with Oasis and being in a pub on his own, to which Liam responds with anger at the idea of a so-called rulebook and the word truly the voice of a generation. They also discuss Liam messing around with people on the ferry, to which he says isn't doing anyone harm, leading to a comparison to John Lennon and this amazing bit of dialogue.
John Lennon?
Do you know him?
I don't, but do you?
Yeah.
Well, you must be pretty old. How old are you? 21?
No. About fucking 1005 fucking one.
You're 22?
No, I'm 21.
Right, remember, I watched you being born.
Right then.
And I don't even know John Lennon. Right then. So shut the fuck up about knowing John Lennon.
So what are you trying to say then?
Noel and Liam both argue about the band's image and how much they look like bad boys, to which Harris asks why in the song Cigarettes and Alcohol there was a reference to white lines or cocaine. Noel responds saying it's a part of life, to which Liam adds that people have little fights now and again. But Noel disagrees and starts urging Liam to talk about music. Harris talks about Oasis's bus, as people have claimed that they are full of drugs, and asks if that's a side that Noel can go to which he reiterates his point about drugs being part of life, much to Liam's continued rage. Harris mentions that the Who hated each other and Liam says he hates Noel, so Harris asks if it's important that they hate each other, and Liam responds saying that it's why they'll be the best band in the world. This description of hate descends into Liam fantasizing about smashing Noel's nose in with a Rickenbacker guitar. The last words we hear are Harris asking whether the pair have any recurring dreams. Noel says there's only one, and when Harris requests what it is, Liam interjects saying it's him taking over the band. And that was Wibbling Rivalry. Despite the interview being recorded in 1994, it took a while, until 1995 in fact, until it was released. This was because the record label, Fierce Panda, were worried that they'd get in hot legal water because Oasis were signed to Creation Records. However, they were eventually called by Sony Music, who managed Oasis worldwide, to say that they loved it. Both of the brothers were also okay with it being released. When this single came out, Oasis was so popular at the time that this 40-minute chaos of an interview actually charted at number 52 on the UK charts. Now I know that that's not particularly high, but considering the fact that it had no promotion, it was under the name of Oasis with an asterisk replacing the I, it was released by a completely random label, and that it was just such complete insanity, it was incredibly impressive, and to this day no interview has ever charted higher, which just goes to show the stranglehold that Oasis had on the UK. People were willing to purchase a vinyl copy of two brothers arguing for 14 minutes, just because it was Oasis. However, over time Oasis's relevance slowly faded from memory, and the Gallaghers' constant fights eventually led to Noel quitting the band in 2009. Since then, the brothers have gone on to forge their own separate careers. Noel is part of the band Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds, and Liam has started his own solo career. Both of them have released 3 studio albums under their respective names, so the brothers are definitely doing alright for themselves, and there's been speculation of a possible reunion this year, but considering their tumultuous relationship, I somewhat doubt it. Until then, we'll simply have to speculate and look back at moments like these, treasuring the time that Oasis spent together creating some classic albums as well as some poorer efforts in addition. But those are all stories for perhaps another time. That was the story of Wibbling Rivalry.